This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, this video will be discussing Ash Wednesday, and really the season of Lent, but focusing on Ash Wednesday as it's coming up next week. The Ash Wednesday worship service is structured really around repentance, and thereby forgiveness. And that's going to be the focus of our conversation. So, repentance is a term, metanoia in Greek, that means actually a change of mind, a change of mindset that leads really toward turning around and going the other direction. And it's worth us thinking about this because in order to start this process of turning around, it begins with an admittance, a confession of sin. And I want to talk about this confession of sin because the Ash Wednesday service and almost all of our worship services begin with a confession of sin. And first, a couple of notes about this. One is that it is a confession of sin. It's not a confession of simply some moderate problems or something, but sinfulness, missing the mark, that there is a spiritual problem in the world and everything is not as it should be. There is this brokenness of sin and sinfulness. And so this is not a marginal issue, but instead a critical one. And then confession is our making plain an admittance of two things. One are the wrongs we have done. And in the Ash Wednesday service, more than any other service in the church here, we emphasize it's these wrongs we have done, that which I've done by my own fault, my own grievous fault. And that's a real part of confession. If you're going to confess something, you're confessing things you have done. And for a very long time in the Lutheran Church, this was probably the whole emphasis. What is it you personally have done? However, that's really not the whole picture. Because yes, we all do things wrong. We all err. Sometimes we err deliberately, and sometimes we err accidentally, but it is still erring. It is still sin. But then there is sometimes what is called sinfulness. Or, that sin is instead of just wrongs, that is actions I've done, but a very cosmic force in this world, bigger than any one person's action. That there is a power of sin in the world. Sometimes it's described simply as capital S sin, to try to say this is a character doing something in this world. And in our liturgy, we do use words like enslavement and bondage to sin and captive to sin, cannot free ourselves. And so we have this idea of not just bad things you've done, but being in a world of sin, of sinfulness. It is, in more modern terms, probably might be translated as what we have come to use the language of structural evil, meaning that there are systems that are perpetuating wrongs in this world we live in. We ourselves, born into this, did not start these systems that that are doing wrong things, yet we perpetuate them, and not necessarily willfully. On the one hand, it's willful in the sense of if everyone simply stopped acting in this way and stopped organizing society in this way, then it would stop. And yet, it's bigger than any one individual. It's if one person stopping, it does not stop that structural evil. Now, that's sort of a modern societal parallel. It's not necessarily exactly the same thing, but I think it's a helpful parallel because it shows you the way in which that when we are confessing, we're confessing two things. We are confessing that we do things wrong, and we're also confessing that we have a weakness as humans caught in the power of sin in the world that has bound us, and we, therefore, individually, do indeed sin. Just like structurally we are born into a system that is inherently unfair and wrong, and we, in living in that system, are perpetuating it. It is simultaneously not entirely our fault, often not a helpful conversation one way or the other, and also our fault. In the sense we didn't start it, we are perpetuating it. We may not be able to stop it, and yet we're the actors who are continuing it. That might be a helpful way of thinking about confession because it emphasizes both sides of what is going on with repentance. And when we're talking about turning around and going the other direction, we have to first admit that we do things wrong. We live in a world that is pushing us to do things wrong. There is a spiritual problem. There is, for example, what Paul called the present evil age as a characteristic of where we live. That things are simply not just fine wherever we are, in whatever setting. That this world is built with inequality, unfairness, pain, grief, and death. Now, all of this leads to, though, that's repentance, and then there is forgiveness. And if we are confessing both sides of the structural evil in this evil age, then the forgiveness also speaks to both sides of this. Yes, indeed, the individual wrongs that we have done. And this you might think of in Romans 2 and 3, wherein the wrongs we have done ought to be punished. There is guilt for doing wrong things spiritually before God, and of those we are forgiven. We do not have to pay the penalty for said guilt. That is a real aspect of that forgiveness. But honestly, it's in the New Testament, maybe not the most important aspect. And I emphasize that because for a very long time in the Lutheran Church, that was all that was focused on. But really, the bigger piece is this same bigger piece on this side, then it's going to be on this side too. What does forgiveness look like for structural evil? It's not forgiven in the sense of this idea of, well, I've done wrong things, but the wrong things I've done are kind of over, and so it's just a matter of dealing with the guilt from those wrong things. Well, the problem with structural evil is they continue to do these wrong things. We say we're going to turn around and go the other direction, and yet we don't really turn around and go the other direction. Well, how do we do this? How do we stop living in the present evil age? Well, the short answer is we can't. There is no way to avoid living in this present evil age this side of eternity. And so instead, what do we say to emphasize there is a forgiveness for you living in this corrupted world? On Ash Wednesday, what do we say? You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now, many see this as a very dark statement, but I want to emphasize the grace within that. That being dust, being from the earth, is a message of grace and life. Yes, it indicates that there is death, But that is also part of what we're confessing is true about the world. And we also are recognizing that we are human. We are not God. God can deal with this structural evil in the world and eventually will. We're not going to be able to do that. And it is a moment of freedom that we can be the hands and feet of Jesus as humans, and we can work against this present evil age, but we're not going to solve this present evil age because we are humans. We are but dust, and to dust we shall return, and you, God, are God. It tells us who are we, who is God. Luther liked to talk about how is God revealed? Where do we see God most revealed? And he'd say here in the action of the cross. That is, in the cross we see God acting in the manner in which God is always acting, which is fundamentally about forgiveness. That we who are human are before a God whose primary action in our lives is one of forgiveness, which is the message of grace to those caught in the structural evil of the cosmic force and enslavement to sin, which is to say every human being. And so, in this Ash Wednesday service of repentance, it really is a trust that God is a God who forgives. I am human, you are God. That is what we confess in our own sinfulness. It's what we trust from the forgiveness. And it's similarly what we confess when we're confessing our faith in the creeds or in different manners, that I am human, you are God. This has been Theology Bits with Pastor Ben.